The sound of a T-34 tank dying is not a boom. It is a scream, a high-pitched tea-kettle shriek of escaping gas followed by the wet, heavy thud of 30 tons of steel settling into its own grave. It was 14:12 on April 16, 1945, the outskirts of Berlin. The air tasted of pulverized brick, cordite, and the sickly sweet smell of rotting unburied bodies. Senior Sergeant Ivan Volkov, a 32-year-old welder from the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, lay pressed into the gutter of a cobblestone street, watching the pride of the Soviet Union burn. 50 meters ahead, the lead tank of his column, a T-34-85 named Motherland, sat motionless. A neat thumb-sized hole had been punched through the side of its turret. There was no massive explosion, no shattered armor plating, just that tiny black hole. But inside, the crew was already dead, incinerated instantly by a jet of superplasticized copper moving at 25,000 feet per second. "Panzerfaust!" the infantry commander screamed, diving behind a pile of rubble. "Sniper with a tube!" Volkov didn't fire his submachine gun. He stared at the tank. He was an engineer, not a grunt. He saw the world in welds, stress points, and thermal gradients. And what he was seeing was impossible. The T-34 had 45 millimeters of sloped armor. It was designed to deflect solid kinetic shells. It was the tank that won the Battle of Kursk. But here, in the concrete canyons of Berlin, it was being slaughtered by 14-year-old Hitler youth boys holding metal tubes that cost 5 marks to manufacture. The Panzerfaust, tank fist, was a nightmare of physics. It didn't rely on speed. It used a shaped charge, a hollow cone of explosive lined with copper. When it hit the tank, the explosive focused all its energy into a single, needle-thin point of molten metal. It ignored the slope. It ignored the thickness. It simply melted a hole through the steel and sprayed the interior with liquid fire. "We can't move up," the tank battalion commander, Major Petrov, roared, slamming his fist against a brick wall. "Every window is a firing port. Every cellar is a trap. I've lost 6 tanks in 2 blocks. We are blind and we are naked." Volkov looked at the burning tank. Then he looked at the building next to him. It was a bombed-out residential block, the facade sheared off by artillery. On the second floor, dangling precariously from the ruined floorboards, was a metal bed frame, a simple rusty mesh of steel springs and wire. "Major," Volkov said, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation, "the problem isn't the armor. The problem is the distance." "What are you talking about, Sergeant? Do you have a magic spell to stop the rockets?" "No, Comrade Major, but I know how a torch works." Volkov pointed his grease-stained finger at the burning wreck. "The German weapon, it's like an oxyacetylene cutter. It needs to be at the exact right distance from the metal to cut, the focal point. If we trigger it early, if we make it explode before it touches the skin of the tank." "We can't weld more armor," Petrov snapped. "The suspension is already overloaded. The tanks will sink in the mud." "Not heavy armor," Volkov whispered, his eyes locking onto the dangling bed frame. "Air. We armor them with air." The concept was theoretically sound, but practically insane. Spaced armor was a known concept, but they had no manufacturing plant. They had no high-tech mesh. They were in the middle of a war zone, under mortar fire, with 0 supplies. "Give me 2 hours, Volkov said, pulling his welding goggles down over his eyes. "And give me permission to loot." "Loot what?" "Every bedroom in this sector." For the next 120 minutes, the battlefield witnessed one of the most bizarre logistical operations of the Second World War. Volkov organized a squad of bewildered infantrymen. They didn't storm enemy bunkers. They stormed apartments. They kicked down doors. They dragged mattresses off beds. They stripped ruined hotels. They were hunting for the grid. Volkov needed steel mesh. The heavy, spring-loaded iron grids that German civilians slept on were perfect. They were tough, flexible, and most importantly, they were everywhere. He dragged a welding generator, a heavy petrol-guzzling beast, into a protected courtyard. The blue-white arc of the electric torch lit up the darkening sky. Hiss, crackle, snap. Volkov worked with the frantic speed of a man possessed. He wasn't building a weapon, he was building a cage. He cut the bed frames into panels. He welded crude brackets onto the turret of the surviving tank. Stalin's fist. He mounted the bed springs so they stood 30 centimeters, about 12 inches, away from the main armor. The tank looked ridiculous. It looked like a moving junk pile. It looked like a homeless shelter on tracks. The infantrymen laughed. The tankers cursed, saying it would block their vision. "It looks like my grandmother's porch," the driver spat, kicking the rusty springs. "The Germans will die of laughter." "Laughing is better than burning," Volkov grunted, checking the weld strength. "Bring me a captured Panzerfaust." The laughter stopped. "You want to shoot at my tank?" Major Petrov asked, stepping forward. "We have to know, Major. If it doesn't work, we're all dead tomorrow anyway. We need a live fire test." They cleared the alleyway. The modified T-34 sat at the end of the street, its rusty Bedspring Armor looking fragile and pathetic against the backdrop of the ruined city. Volkov picked up the captured German launcher. It was a Panzerfaust 60. Simple, deadly. He walked 40 meters away. He knelt behind a pile of rubble. He raised the tube. He wasn't a soldier who shot to kill men. He was a welder testing a seam. He lined up the iron sights with the center of the bed spring panel welded to the turret. "Fire in the hole!" He squeezed the firing lever. Whoosh! The warhead launched with a puff of black powder smoke, arching through the air like a sluggish football. It covered the distance in 2 seconds. The men held their breath. They expected the familiar scream of molten metal, the flash of catastrophic failure. The warhead hit the bed springs. Crack! The explosion was deafening, but it sounded wrong. It lacked the wet, piercing thud of a penetration. It was a sharp, dry slap, like a giant hand hitting a metal sheet. Smoke engulfed the tank. Volkov dropped the launcher tube and ran forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Major Petrov was right behind him. As the smoke cleared, the T-34 emerged. The bed spring panel was destroyed, shredded into twisted wire and shrapnel. A black scorch mark about the size of a dinner plate marred the green paint of the turret armor. But there was no hole. The Panzerfaust had detonated on the mesh 30 centimeters away from the tank's skin. The superheated jet of copper had formed, but it had formed too early. It had traveled through 12 inches of empty air. By the time it hit the actual armor, the focused beam had dissipated, turning from a piercing needle into a splash of hot liquid. It had scorched the paint. It had panicked the crew, but it had not penetrated. "It works," Petrov whispered, running his hand over the warm, blackened steel. "By God, the junk works." He turned to Volkov. "How long to equip the company?" "I need every welder in the battalion," Volkov said, staring at the thousands of windows in the distance. "And I need 500 beds." The night of April 17th became known among the 2nd Guards Tank Army as the Night of the Iron Mattresses. It was an industrial frenzy. Tanks pulled up to Volkov's courtyard assembly line in shifts. Welding torches hissed like snakes. Sparks cascaded down the sides of the armored beasts. Infantry squads were sent out on bed raids. They returned carrying ornate iron frames from bombed mansions, simple wire grids from worker tenements, even crib sides. If it was steel and it had holes, Volkov used it. They weren't just welding, they were modifying the silhouette of the Soviet Army. By dawn on April 18th, 120 tanks had been fitted with the Volkov cage. They looked terrifying, grotesque, rusty porcupines of war. Then the order came. Advance to the Reichstag. The assault on central Berlin was the bloodiest urban battle in history. The Germans had turned the city into a fortress. But this time, the equation had changed. As Volkov's column pushed down the Frankfurter Alley, the ambush began. From a third-story window, a Hitler youth soldier leaned out and fired a Panzerfaust at the lead tank. Bang! The warhead hit the Bedspring cage. The mesh disintegrated. The jet dissipated. The tank didn't stop. The turret traversed, the 85mm gun roared, and the sniper position was vaporized. "Left flank! Cellar window!" the radio crackled. Another rocket hit, another Bedspring sacrificed, another tank saved. The psychological impact on the German defenders was devastating. Their wonder weapon, the device promised to save the Reich, was bouncing off furniture. They saw their rockets explode, saw the smoke clear, and saw the relentless red machines keep coming. Panic set in. Volkov rode on the back of the command tank, a welding torch in one hand and a submachine gun in the other. He wasn't fighting, he was performing triage. When a tank lost its cage, he would jump off, drag a replacement bed frame from a ruin, and weld it back on under live fire. At 11:30 a.m. near the Spree River, the column hit a kill zone. 4 Tiger II King Tigers were dug in at the end of the bridge, supported by dozens of Panzerfaust troops. "They're swarming us," the radio screamed. A T-34 named Red Fury was hit 3 times in 5 seconds. The first 2 rockets detonated on the mesh screens. The third rocket hit a bare spot where the screen had been blown away. The tank caught fire, but the screens had bought time. Those first 2 shots should have killed the crew instantly. Instead, they were alive long enough to return fire. They put a shell directly into the track of the lead Tiger, immobilizing it. Volkov saw a tank commander, Lieutenant Zoya, screaming for help. Her tank side cage was gone, and infantry were closing in. "Cover me!" Volkov yelled to a machine gunner. He grabbed a loose section of heavy iron fence, not a bed, but a garden gate, and sprinted across the bullet-swept bridge. He didn't have time to weld. He scrambled up the side of the moving tank. A German soldier popped up from a manhole, Panzerfaust leveled. Volkov literally threw the garden gate over the side of the tank, holding it in place with his gloved hands and his boot. The rocket hit the gate. The explosion blew Volkov off the tank. He flew 3 meters through the air, landing hard on the cobblestones. His welding goggles shattered. Shrapnel tore through his shoulder. The concussive force knocked the wind out of him. He looked up, vision swimming. The garden gate was twisted scrap, but the tank was turning its turret. The machine gun opened up, cutting the German attacker in half. Lieutenant Zoya popped the hatch. She looked at the smoking debris hanging off her tank, then at the welder bleeding in the street. She gave him a thumbs up. Volkov tried to smile, but his face was covered in soot. He passed out as the tank rolled forward, crushing the Panzerfaust tube beneath its treads. The Battle of Berlin ended on May 2, 1945. The city was a ruin, but the tanks were alive. Military analysts later inspected the Second Guard's tank army's vehicles. They found tanks with scorch marks that told a story of impossible survival. Some hulls had taken 5, 6, even 10 hits from shaped charges. Without the iron mattresses, every single one of those hits would have been a penetration. Every penetration would have been a dead crew. Based on casualty reports and damage assessments, historians estimate that Ivan Volkov's stolen Bedsprings saved approximately 120 tanks from total destruction. Considering a crew of 4 or 5 men per tank, plus the infantry riding on top who were shielded from shrapnel, the number of lives saved in those final 2 weeks exceeds 600. 600 men who went home to their families because a welder saw a chicken coop and understood physics. Ivan Volkov woke up in a field hospital 3 days after the surrender. He didn't receive the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. The Soviet High Command was embarrassed. They didn't want to admit that their glorious tanks needed garbage to survive. They wanted to project strength, not improvisation. The Bedspring Armor, officially noted in German reports as Thoma Schürzen or wire mesh skirts, was quietly removed from the tanks before the victory parades. The official news reels showed gleaming, pristine T-34s, not the rusty, mattress-covered warriors that actually won the street fights. Volkov returned to the tractor factory in Chelyabinsk. He went back to welding chassis. He never patented his idea. He never bragged about it. But the idea didn't die. Physics is stubborn. 60 years later, in the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, American Strykers and British Warrior fighting vehicles began appearing with strange, slat-like cages bolted to their sides. They called it slat armor or bar armor. The soldiers called it the cage. It was designed to defeat the RPG-7, the grandson of the Panzerfaust. The principle was exactly the same: disrupt the warhead, detonate it early, crush the fuse between the bars. It is a high-tech, precision-engineered alloy grid now, costing thousands of dollars per square foot. But if you strip away the fancy contracts and the military jargon, it is exactly what Ivan Volkov built in a Berlin courtyard. It is a metal bed frame standing between a soldier and a shaped charge. Ivan Volkov died in 1982 of lung complications from years of welding fumes. His grave in Chelyabinsk is modest. There is no tank on the pedestal. But local veterans say that on Victory Day, old tankers would come by. They wouldn't bring flowers. They would bring small scraps of rusty wire mesh and leave them on the headstone. A silent acknowledgement that when the technology failed, when the armor wasn't enough, when the politicians were miles away, it was the rust, the scrap, and the welder's torch that brought them home. If this story of high-stakes improvisation and welding under fire sparked something in you, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. We are excavating the most insane, gritty, true stories of military history every single day. Don't just watch the history. Help us keep it alive.